Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our program today. My name is Jen Maxey. I am the Assistant Director of Public Programs at the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles. For those of you who may not know us here, we are a cultural center and a museum rooted in the Jewish values of welcoming all, pursuing justice, and building community. Our hope is that by sharing stories, we're helping to create a more just society with empathy as a key ingredient. It is our great honor today to welcome two brilliant women to our virtual stage, both of whose work is aimed at sharing stories that provoke empathy and change. Lynsey Addario is the recipient of a Pulitzer Prize as well as a MacArthur Fellowship. She has photographed humanitarian emergencies and conflicts around the world and has been described as bringing an incredible sense of humanity to all battlefields. Her images have appeared in the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, and National Geographic. It was for this very human lens that Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn, themselves Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, tapped Lynsey to accompany them across America as they documented complex human suffering happening right here in our own backyards for their book, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. It is Lynsey's photographs that bring the stories in Nick and Sheryl's book to life. And currently you can view Tightrope as an online exhibition at the Skirball website, skirball.org. And I encourage everyone to check that out. Joining Lynsey is the formidable Sheryl WuDunn, a finance executive, journalist, author, lecturer, and the recipient of many awards, including a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of the Tiananmen Square uprising, becoming the first Asian American reporter to ever win that prize. Sheryl is the co-author of 5 books with her journalist husband, Nick Kristof, and the Skirball has been privileged to present 2 previous exhibitions based on Kristof WuDunn books before Tightrope, Half the Sky and A Path Appears. In each of these books, Nick and Sheryl's interrogation of human suffering around the world bring a hope that we can all be moved to be part of positive change. So it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Sheryl WuDunn, who will kick off our conversation today. Sheryl?
Thank you, Jan. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to be here and very excited and hope that you will enjoy the next hour in discussion with Lynsey Addario. I just want to tee it up because I'm going to obviously want you to listen as much as possible to what Lynsey has to say. But Nick and I chose her for reasons that Jen mentioned, that she's an incredible visual artist and sees things that people just don't normally see. She has an attention to detail that's just remarkable. I want her to start off, and she's, going to be delighted to share with you some of the, what made her so spectacular and what she is. And that led us to choose her to ask her to help us with some photographs for Tightrope. So Lynsey, take it away.
Hi. So I am just going to start sharing my screen immediately. So I have written 2 books. One is a photographic book, a coffee table book, and I'm going to go into my first story. In the 90s, I was working in New York City for the Associated Press, and I was really learning how to photograph. And I didn't really know how to tell stories at that point. I would go to Spot News and City Hall and protests. And in 1999, the Associated Press came to me with a story about the transgender prostitution community in New York City in the meatpacking district. And apparently there was a series of murders in that community, and they wanted to sort of get to the heart of why that was happening. And so I spent 6 months trying to embed myself in this community. And it was the first time that I had to really try to get access to people with whom I had no contact, and that they weren't necessarily welcoming to having a photographer around. So I initially started out with an organization that parked a van in the middle of the meatpacking district, distributed condoms, helped the women in any way they could. And I started hanging out for a few weeks without my cameras. And finally, after 2 weeks, Kima, one of the women, said to me, "Hey girl, you want to take pictures? Come to our apartment and at 1 in the morning, and you can hang out with us." So I went up at 1 in the morning, was up in the Bronx, and this is one of the first scenes I saw. And they would inject themselves with illegal hormones and really started posing for the camera. And I ended up spending 6 months every Thursday, Friday, Saturday night within this community, and really started learning how to try to photograph not only what you see on the street, but sort of what people's private lives, and to create a document of their lives. And so these are some of the scenes. This is 1999. And then the year after was the first time I ended up going abroad. And I had moved to India in 2000 and was living, I was renting a room from the Dow Jones bureau chief. And he was going in and out of Afghanistan under the Taliban. And he came back and he said, you know, you care about women's issues. You should be in Afghanistan right now, photographing women living under the Taliban. And of course, I was 26 and I said, oh, that's a great idea. So I had no money. I borrowed money from my sister and I called my mother and I said, Mom, I'm going to Afghanistan tomorrow. And she said, okay, honey, have a good time. Because this is before September 11th and no one had any idea that Afghanistan was this really, really tough place. So I went, and the only women I saw were on the streets were widows and women who had to beg for money to keep, you know, to feed their children. And I learned very quickly that as a woman, my gender was really enabled me access into women's home. And I was able to get into the women's hospitals. And at this point, photography of any living thing was illegal under the Taliban. So I had to learn how to photograph quickly, how to gain the trust of the people I photographed. This was a woman in labor under the Taliban. And these are secret girls' schools that very brave Afghan families would open their homes to girls in the community and have these secret schools. And they would often teach, and this is what they looked like. And that was illegal. It was illegal for girls to be educated under the Taliban in 2000. And one day I was documenting the drought in Herat in Western Afghanistan, and my driver said, Madam, I have to go because my brother is getting married. And I thought, what would a wedding look like under the Taliban? Because all forms of entertainment were illegal at that time. And so I said, well, can I come? And he said, sure. And we walked down these silent streets because music, everything was illegal. And we descended down these stone stairs inside of a compound. Many of the houses are in these behind stone walls, cement walls. And this is the first scene I saw, which was the Titanic was blasting. This couple was dancing. This is women had makeup, men and women mixing. And I learned from this scene that even in the most dire of circumstances, in the worst, in war, whatever it is, it's human nature to try to find some way to have fun and to continue living. And so I learned to look for these scenes in future war zones where I went. September 11th happened. I went back to Afghanistan to cover the fall of the Taliban. I then went into Iraq to cover the fall of Saddam Hussein. I spent the majority of 2003 and 4 in Iraq. This is one of the first mass graves unearthed in Hilla, south of Baghdad. This is the first time I had ever seen anything like this. Each one of these white sheets is the body of a loved one. Shiites who were killed under Saddam were not able to mourn their loved ones openly. So this is someone coming to find the body of his loved one and weeping. While we prepared for the war in Iraq, there was really no plan for the aftermath. So many people found themselves with no electricity, no water, no gas. These protests started, and very soon after, the insurgency started. As a journalist, this was the first time that I had ever requested to do a military embed. I ended up going to the heart of the Sunni Triangle, like an hour outside of Baghdad, and started documenting conflict. And in Fallujah, which was one of the biggest battles, I'd say, of our generation, I didn't choose to go to the front line, but ended up going to the trauma hospital where all the wounded soldiers, all the wounded Marines were coming out of Fallujah. And this is, I think it was on my birthday, actually, in 2004. And what you're looking at is the inside of a C-17 cargo aircraft. And there are so many wounded soldiers coming out of Fallujah that they were laying on the floor of the aircraft. They cleared out the aircraft, and this is how they were flown to Germany for treatment. And this is another wounded soldier. This is the first time I had ever seen scenes like this. The government was very strategic about what journalists were allowed to see during the war in Iraq. So I photographed this. I sent it back to Life magazine. Life magazine held these photographs for almost 4 months through the re-election of George Bush. And I finally got an email from my photo editor saying, I hate to tell you this, but we will never run these images of wounded soldiers because the American public can't handle them. Or the editor-in-chief felt the American public could not handle them. Well, I was furious, of course, and I said, well, how dare you send me to war if you don't have the guts to publish the images? I continued documenting the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2007, was in the Korengal Valley for the New York Times Magazine. We spent 2 months living on the side of a mountain with the 173rd Airborne, ended up going on a battalion-wide operation called Operation Rock Avalanche, which was also featured in the movie Restrepo by Sebastian Junger and Tim Hetherington. And these are some of the scenes. We walked through the mountains for 6 days, basically waiting to get attacked by the Taliban. And eventually on day 6, we were hit from 3 different sides. 3 soldiers were shot. Sergeant Rugel, whose body is in the body bag here, was killed. And these are very sensitive moments. I likely would not have been able to photograph this situation of wounded and dead soldiers had I not spent 2 months living with the troops. 1 year later, I went directly on the other side of the valley with Dexter Filkins for the New York Times Magazine to meet the Taliban. And this was a very difficult story because I, as a woman, was in a part of the world where women don't leave their homes. So right before we were going to meet the Taliban, the commander who was welcoming us said, whatever you do, don't bring a woman. Obviously, that posed some difficulty. Dexter and I pretended we were husband and wife. We were able to go, and eventually the commander enabled me to take photographs. In 2004, I started working in Africa and started covering the war in Darfur. The government wouldn't give journalists visas, so we had to walk in from neighboring Chad. These are some of the very early scenes from August of 2004. We walked in, we ended up in Northwest Darfur. We saw villages that were burned to the ground. There were skeletons clear across the desert, people fleeing for their lives. This is before the big camps had been set up in neighboring Chad. So they would literally flee from their homes and walk until they couldn't stand anymore. This was the first time a woman admitted to me of being raped as a weapon of war. It was incredibly brave of her and a very sensitive moment. And these are some of the scenes of the government attacks on villages. These places are very difficult to get to for journalists. One of the hardest things for us photographers and journalists who cover conflict is actually getting access to these scenes because there aren't roads. You can't just jump on a highway and go to something like this. So we were able to convince the World Food Program to let us fly on their helicopter. Initially, they said there was no space for journalists. I was working with Lydia Polgreen for the New York Times, and she was so furious and said, don't you understand the power of an image? You need to let at least Lynsey on the helicopter, if not me, so the world can see what the government has done here. And this photograph appeared on the front page of the New York Times. And these are some of the people who were displaced from that village. So I ended up covering Darfur for 6 straight years. Every year going back, sometimes I was able to get a visa, sometimes I was not. Sometimes I ended up walking in or traveling in from Chad again. But it was a story. Actually, it was the first time that I think Nick and I, our work overlapped. Sheryl's husband, our work overlapped in Darfur. I continued on to cover the conflict in Congo. This is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And again, seeing a lot of those patterns of stories of rape as a weapon of war. This woman had been enslaved for 3 years and gave birth, actually for 6 years, and gave birth to both of her children. This is in North Kivu in Eastern Congo. So all of these people told their stories very bravely. And this is Ayak, who was from South Sudan, and a very similar story. She had been assaulted during the conflict in South Sudan, and became pregnant, and she fled to Uganda, and this is where I met her. In 2009, I won a MacArthur Fellowship, and I wanted to find something very specific to dedicate my time to, because it was the first time I had been given money with no strings attached, and I can really focus on telling stories without an assignment. So I started looking into maternal mortality and why at that point so many women were dying in childbirth. In 2009, over 500,000 women a year were dying in childbirth. So I started looking at the countries where those numbers were the highest. In Afghanistan, this was one of the countries. I spent 2 weeks in Badakhshan province documenting women who had to walk for hours to get to their nearest medical facility. Often when they got there, there was no electricity. And prenatal checks were done sometimes in people's homes in the middle of a village. A midwife would come and tend to everyone at once. At the end of that 2 weeks, I was driving back to Faizabad, the capital, and we saw these two women on the side of the mountain and immediately thought something was wrong because there was no man with these women. And in rural Afghanistan, women are always accompanied by a man. And so we stopped the car and said, "What's going on? Is something wrong?" And it turned out the woman on the right, Noor Nisa, was in labor and her water had just broken. And her husband's first wife had died in childbirth. And he was so worried about losing Noor Nisa that he managed to get a car to take her to a hospital. And that car broke down. And so that's when we found her. And I said, "Well, just get in my car. I'll take you to the hospital." And she said, "I can't. I need my husband's permission." And I turned to my translator, Dr. Ziba, and said, "Ziba, go find her husband." Well, there was one road in the whole province, and so she was able to find him. And I brought the family to the hospital, and she delivered safely. And everyone asked me if I took pictures of the delivery, and I did not because I felt like I had altered the story with my presence. This is a woman who's going to a prenatal check, and these are some scenes from the hospital in Afghanistan. And I continued doing this work in Sierra Leone. In 2010, I was working in remote areas and then ended up going to the Magbaraka Government Hospital where I met Mama Cisse. Mama Cisse was pregnant with twins. She gave birth to the first baby in the village and the second baby wouldn't come out. Her sister, who was a midwife, was so worried about her sister delivering in Sierra Leone because 1 in 8 women had a risk of dying in childbirth that she sent her an ambulance. In order to get to that ambulance, she took a canoe across a river, got in the ambulance, and then had to drive another 6 hours. And that's when I met her. We spoke at length about her life. She had been studying at the university. She wanted to continue her studies, but her father made her quit so she can have children. She finally delivered the second baby. And all of the attention went to the baby because it had been inside her for almost 12 hours at that point. All the midwives gathered around her daughter, and Mama Cisse started hemorrhaging. And I kept asking, "Are you sure she's okay? It seems like a lot of blood." And the midwives were just sort of cleaning it up and said, "Yeah, she's fine. She's fine." Finally, I got very nervous and I said, "Well, maybe you should take her blood pressure." And it was 60/30 at that point. I ran to find a doctor and everyone sort of laughed at me and said there's one doctor in the whole province and he was in surgery. And I actually put on scrubs, went into surgery and tried to say, "I think someone's dying." And he just looked at me and was like, "Well, when I'm finished." So I convinced the women to carry Mama Cisse over to near the doctor's office when he got out of surgery. And when he came out, he took her blood pressure and she was already dead. And this is Mama Cisse's mother learning that her daughter had just died in childbirth. And this is her funeral. So Sheryl, maybe you have any questions here? I'm about to go into the America section.
Well, no, it's so powerful. I mean, this is really the reason why we really were so delighted that you were able to shoot some photographs. I mean, a lot of these images are just heart-rendering. And I think that what we were trying to do in Tightrope was to talk about how important it was for us Americans to understand that there's a lot of pain and a lot of suffering that is visual and visible in America as well. It's not just the pain and suffering is happening abroad. And so, yeah, please take us through some of the images that you took when you were in America.
So this is a story I did for the New York Times Magazine in 2011, I think it was. yeah, it was 2011 because I brought my 3 or 4 month old son with me on assignment. And and so I will actually play an audio. It's an audio slideshow. So I'll just let you see.
Yeah, I thought, years ago when they said when I get older, I can do this and I can do that. You can't even eat when you get old. My name is Mamie Marshall. I worked at General Motors, Packard Electric. I drove school bus for Jackson Public School. I'm a licensed beautician.
And you still don't have full health care?
No.
My name is Lavatris Jordan. I'm from Starkville, Mississippi.
My name is Vonda Wells. I am 41, and I have congestive heart failure and chronic asthma.
Denia Sturdivant. I have diabetes, hypertension, renal failure. I have a lot.
So that's the problem I have most of the time, trying to, get the food to stay on my diet. Most of the food that you're supposed to eat is low sodium. That hard to do, to buy low sodium food, because food you buy at the grocery store, most of it got salt in it. That's the salt. I don't have the money to buy that diet food, And diabetes is bad on shortening your wind. Sometimes you feel like doing something, sometimes you don't feel like getting up or doing nothing.
They have data now that if you don't get by the 3rd grade the obesity fixed, you can forget about that kid. But the delta is 45% obese. What you want as a consumer is to be healthy. Health care means that you're already sick and I'm going to try to fix you, whether it's trauma or diabetes or whatever. We're just trying to correct the problem. That's not what we should be doing. We should be doing preventive health. There are right at 600,000 in Mississippi with no health insurance. So we have some problems.
I was like, well, Mom, I got something to tell you. And she was like, what? I said, I think I'm gay. She said, it's a lonely life, and there's a big possibility that you can get AIDS. And it was hard. It was a lot of mixed emotions. It's like I wanted to tell somebody, but I felt like I couldn't tell anybody because nobody would understand. And then behind me actually coming out, just not even positive, but just as being gay, my family they weren't really comfortable with that idea.
Yes, I just had twins. They were born at 26 and a half weeks due to incompetent cervix. LaGlorian was 1 pound, 11 ounces, and LaDorian was 1 pound, 14 ounces.
The health of the mother when she becomes pregnant, say the preconceptual period, influences her infant's adult health 20 years down the road.
I got pregnant when I was 16. When I got pregnant, I was 16. A month later, I turned 17. When they were 2 weeks old, they called me to come tell Abby bye because they didn't think she was going to make it. Because she was requiring so much power from the ventilator, it was damaging her lungs and her heart. They told me to take her off because she was suffering, but I was like, if she's supposed to go, then God will take her. If not, then I'm not doing it.
I had a stent put in September, and that bill was right at $70,000. And then I've been in the hospital probably 15 to 20 times since then.
I'm the non-compliant patient. That's why I usually wind up in the hospital. Because I'll take myself off of my blood pressure pills. If I'm feeling good, I don't take them. It's like Medicaid can't pay for it. I can't pay for the medicine, so. Now that $90 a pop for the deal now, and not to mention what the blood pressure pills cost. Do what you can.
We still have got to get people in front of people to talk about health. We still have got to try to understand, particularly obesity, and we've got to get lots more providers here and do health, not just health care.
So now we'll go into Tightrope.
Yeah, no, that was really, really powerful. And I guess the key here is to, actually, were a lot of those photographs all over the country in different places or concentrated in Southeast?
Mississippi. They were all Mississippi. Yeah. And it was modeled on, there was a doctor, Dr. Shirley, who had this idea of modeling healthcare after healthcare in Iran, where they do preventative healthcare. So they send nurses out to people's homes to check on them so they don't end up in the emergency room. So to sort of do preventative, and it was working in that area.
Yeah, we need to do much more of it. I mean, so here is Clayton Greene. If I may talk a little bit about Clayton Greene, that Lynsey came with us to visit his home. And so Tightrope is set in, is anchored in Yamhill, Oregon, where Clayton grew up and lived. And, you know, he was on the school bus that Nick took, number 6 school bus, every single day. At the time we wrote the book, which came out a year ago, there were one quarter of the people on the bus are no longer with us. They passed away. You know, since then, including Clayton, we actually have recounted, and it's now closer to 1/3 of them have passed away. I mean, it's not getting any better. And so here is Clayton, who at his peak grew to about 450 pounds. You know, he could barely get up, but he did work on our farm. He did work for us. You know, believe it or not, he was very intelligent. You look at him, you think, oh my goodness, this person, what could he do? Well, he was better than Nick, believe it or not, at fixing a tractor. There were times when Nick was fiddling around trying to figure it out, and we had no idea how to fix the tractor, called on Clayton, and Clayton looked at it for 15 minutes and fixed it. So he had a definite skill. But of course, he also turned into a meth drug user and then a meth dealer. He started making meth, and during the course of us interviewing him, he didn't want us to write into the book that he was a meth dealer. And he didn't want us to say that at one point in time, he made $125,000 dealing in meth. Of course, it all disappeared. Finally convinced him, because we were trying to explain that this is who you are, Clayton. So he agreed. And so we put it into the book. You know, shortly before the book was published, Clayton passed away. He didn't make it. But thank you to all the Medicaid coverage, the expanded coverage in Oregon, his family at least was not beset with huge medical bills.
Thank you. So the trick for me, of course, is Sheryl and Nick have these very intimate relationships with many of the characters in the book, and I come in for a few days and have to try to figure out how to depict their lives. So that's always sort of the tricky part of being a photographer who comes in for usually a very short time.
But you did a great job.
I mean, you helped a lot. I think just having the introduction from you both was you know, invaluable. It was amazing. So, and this is Clayton's son, right?
Yes, Ethan.
Yeah.
So this is Ethan, who is so unlike his very heavy dad. You can see Ethan is rail thin. We are convinced that he actually was using a little bit of meth, but he says he's not using drugs. But he is, unlike Clayton, extremely talkative. You cannot get a word in edgewise. And at the same time, though, he's not very diligent in finding work. Clayton was very good about, you know, if he said he was going to come, he was coming. Ethan is a little bit less reliable. That's his girlfriend right behind him. He's showing off the shooting of one of his, what he says is 10 guns that he has. And we've always been nervous going there when he pulls out his guns, you know, but he then told us, you think that I get angry? Because he does, he has a temper. He says, I've got 10 guns and look, I'm still fine. That wasn't exactly a very encouraging response, but Ethan still doesn't have a job, although he did do construction at one point.
So now would you, now this is, she was identified as Molly in the book, is that?
Right. So she is a friend of someone who works on our farm, and that is her son on the trampoline. She has an incredible, sad situation. Her father is also the father of her daughter, who's not here. So in other words, her father raped her, and she had the child, the daughter, and she didn't tell anybody, not even her mother, until her daughter was well, already, basically a teenager. But she raised the daughter, but didn't send her to school. The daughter actually maybe had about 3 or 4 months of formal education in high school when she tried to go to school, but had no idea what was going on in class, and so dropped out again. And now this daughter has about 4 kids by, different partners, and is homeschooling those kids. You can see this is something that's happening right now in rural Oregon. It's not unusual. It is happening in other places of America as well.
What was his name?
This is Drew Goff. Yeah, this is Drew Goff. So Drew is someone who also is the son of someone who worked on our farm. So all these people, their parents were hardworking, individuals. Drew, you see the baby next to him, Ashton. So Drew started using drugs when he was 12. And basically never had a full-time job. We met him at a drug treatment center, and he was on the mend, doing quite well for a while. And then he was able to maintain custody of Ashton, who tiny, right? I think there was a few months old, but he was doing good. He took parenting classes. He was talking to Ashton. He was, cuddling him. He was reading to him. And we thought that Drew was on the mend. The problem with Ashton is that Ashton was born with drugs in his system. So we were worried about a 3rd generation of this repeating this cycle. But so far he's been okay. Just recently, in a few months ago, we learned that Drew lost his job in the pandemic, and then also had a relapse. So we're hoping that he turns around, but we just don't know.
What a shame. Mike Stepp, who was homeless, and he also grew up with Nick. They've known each other. I'll let you talk because you know the story so much more.
Yeah, no, Mike Stepp, again, is someone in McMinnville, which is the biggest town in the Yamhill, Oregon area. And, this is a friend of Nick's. He rode the bus, that number 6 school bus, every day. And who would have thought that, he would have become homeless? And he has 2 kids. He had a family, 2 kids, a wife who obviously, divorced him long ago. And he had options to live in a shelter and also with his sister, but he chose to, be on the streets. We do think that he had some mental health problems. He was surviving okay, even during COVID, did not get COVID. And in the fall, he ran into my mother-in-law. And of course, it was still COVID, but he went over to her and just hugged her, and she was horrified. She's 88, thinking, oh my goodness, because he wasn't wearing a mask, of course. Anyway, so unfortunately, in December, he also passed away. But he had lasted for quite a while during the pandemic until just in early December, and they think it may have been a heart attack.
So we were together this morning, actually. Yeah, this is part of the women's rehabilitation. So yeah,
Yes, this is excellent. This was a story about a great program. And this is why it's so important to spotlight the hopeful solutions. So in Oklahoma, Tulsa, we met this mother and her 2 kids through a program called Women in Recovery. It takes women who are destined for 5 to 10 years in jail, which Rebecca Hale was, and she finally wanted to get into this program, pled to the judge, please let me into this program. I do want to change and reform. And Women in Recovery takes these people, if the underlying reason for addiction is underlying reason for criminality is some addiction to drugs, they will take them in, put them through a detox program for about 1.5 to 2 years. And she had therapy, she had medical treatment, she had dental treatment, she learned computer skills, business skills, she had an apprenticeship, and now she's got a job, and she is a functioning, really functioning person, working in a customer service center So in insurance, so if you ever get a phone call from someone, at a customer service center, you never know who that person is and what her life was like. But Rebecca's on the money.
And Geneva Cooley, of course.
Yes, Geneva. This woman was a drug mule. So decades ago, she was sentenced under the mandatory sentencing for people carrying, possessing drugs. She had a small bag, a tiny little, a baggie full of, drugs. It was heroin, a little bit of, cocaine. And she was carrying it on a train from New York to Alabama. And she got picked up and thrown in jail for 999 years. Well, thankfully, there was someone at the local university who said this is ridiculous because she's nonviolent criminal, petitioned the local judges and got Geneva Cooley freed, for good, just very recently. And Lynsey saw her right there.
Yeah, I actually, I was so moved by Geneva's story, and it's so seldom in our professions that we're able to see sort of full circle. I rarely, you were able to do that with this book, but I rarely go back and visit people that I had photographed. And so when I heard there was a chance Geneva might get out, I emailed Nick and said, do you want to do this with me? Should we do something? And then it turned out I ended up doing it for the New York Times. And I spent Geneva's last day in prison with her, came out of prison with her, photographed her that whole first week, sort of as a free woman. And it was incredible. I mean, she is an amazing woman. She was so open. She was really, to think about what she was going through, having thought she would spend the rest of her life in prison, and to allow me to be with her the first time she went into a supermarket and was walking down the aisles and had all of these choices. There were 75 different types of potato chips, these are like things that were really, anyway, so this was Geneva.
But, it's also important to understand these, just for 1 second about Geneva, that, she's not this dolt. I mean, look, she was a drug mule. She wasn't doing great, but in prison, she actually studied up on the law to figure out what her prospects were. And then she also kept her bed very, very neat. She was on really, really good behavior. And she tried to, convince the other people in jail, her jailmates, to, spruce up the things, get organized, and, try and live a little bit more, upright lives.
So now we are in Baltimore, and this is the veteran of the Iraq War. You were not with me?
No, I was. And so this is Daniel McDowell, and right. Daniel is someone who went to Afghanistan, got blown up by an IED. He got injured permanently in his legs and partly in his back, and he came back to the US for treatment on the base, and they started giving him opioids. And so, his back really hurt. He just, kept upping the prescription was upped. And finally, they said, look, you got to go somewhere else for pain management. This is not our specialty. He went to this other place, this pain management clinic, and they said, you're on more drugs than I would give my cancer patients. Cut it in half. And Daniel needed the opioids. By then he was addicted. In fact, 80% of all people who are heroin addicts actually started off with prescription drugs. So he went to the streets and started buying heroin. He ended up losing his job, his wife, his kid, his friends and family abandoned him, except for his mother, who found him a spot at Baltimore Station, where he is now. And that place has turned him around.
Yeah, it was an incredible place. And again, I spent a few days with him, was able to go to some of the meetings. Everyone was incredible. And then I also did some work on the streets of Baltimore, was able to photograph some addicts. And really, it's hard for me to take these photos because I want to know the full backstory. I want to be spending more time with the people I'm photographing. But I think for the sake of photographing for this book, I also need contextual images. So some of the things I'm doing as a photographer is just looking at different stages of where people are at. This is a man, Sheryl, remind me of the name of the police whose brother passed away.
Steve Olson, yes.
So Steve Olson is a police officer in Baltimore, and he took me sort of around the streets on a patrol one night, and we went to this neighborhood that was very tough. And actually, we passed this guy on the street, and we're talking to him, and he was fine. About 7 minutes later, he was completely tripping. And it was incredible that literally within minutes he transformed. And so I was photographing, and all of the first responders came. They tried giving him Narcan. They weren't sure what drug he was doing. So I think that's the other thing, is that, you know, you're not always sure of what someone's doing, and they're not in the mindset to tell you. And so you know, maybe you want to go in a little bit. I'm not sure if it's if you want to, but Steve,
yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think you've captured, this is the context of Baltimore. They're trying to turn the streets around. And so they're using certain new patrol methods. But, you know, Steve Olson has said, and we write about this in Tightrope, that, you know, he plays part psychologist as well as part police officer. I mean, he's trying to, as a social worker, he's trying to convince these people to come in for treatment, or to come in just, you know, for help.
And part of that came because his brother was an addict, and
yes,
he didn't
yes.
realize, and he, you know, he had no idea. And so he was never would have been open to that idea that his own brother would be an addict, and his brother passed away. And so he kind of made it his mission to look at people with more perspective and addicts, and to change the way they approach people, bring them into the fold, try to help them get clean.
And I would just add one more thing, that this whole story about Baltimore Station is really part of an effort that was started in the Obama administration to turn around veteran homelessness. And they actually, you know, appropriated a huge amount of dollars. They created this huge program across the country, and within 5 or 6 years, they actually reduced veteran homelessness by half. And to his credit, Trump also continued the program and continued to reduce veteran homelessness. So we know we have the tools. We know what it takes to actually reduce homelessness. We just need the will, the political will.
Amazing. So now we go to Annette Dove. And where were we? Arkansas?
Right. So Annette is in Pine Bluff, right? It's probably the worst town in terms of criminality, the number of crimes in America. And she is this, amazing woman who just opens her heart to the kids who are going to school there. And she tries to create the after school programs. She wants to get as many kids as possible going to college, not to mention graduating from high school. And so she goes literally out into the neighborhood to reach out to some of the kids who just haven't been at school, and they're sitting on the couch is one of them.
And then these are just some scenes from around Pine Bluff.
Right, and that's his that's his mom. Yeah, that's his mom, who unfortunately is a drug user.
Okay, and now we're at healthcare.
Right. Oh yes. So we this was very interesting. So there is this one organization that provides healthcare clinics once a day in about 80 towns throughout the US, believe it or not. And so here is a dental clinic where people who probably don't ever get their teeth done, maybe but once a year if they can come to this clinic. And most of them, I don't know if you have this other photo that you're about, I don't know if that's going to be shown, but right, this is the eye thing, but a lot of these people at the dental clinic, they end up having their teeth taken out.
Yeah, I didn't put that one.
That's fine. You have to go to Tightrope to see that photo.
Okay, so that was the Tightrope segment of the presentation. And now I'll just very quickly, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth because I'd love for us to leave time for questions if people have questions, but just a little bit about the current work that I'm doing that I did in the past year. And a lot of it focused on America, COVID, climate change. These are the issues that I've started to look at more closely now. And so this was a story that I've done a lot of work on maternal mortality over the last decade, and also immigration. So one question I had in the last sort of 4 years was, what does an undocumented woman, or a woman who doesn't have proper legal status in the United States, what does she do if she's pregnant? And is she scared to go to the hospital that she will be turned over to the authorities? So I started asking around, and in fact, there were women having home births for the first time because they were too scared to go to the hospital because of the public charge. That was a new law that if you go in and ask for help, or if you end up getting financial help, you might be kicked out of the country. So all of these women do not have legal status. They were pregnant. This is Jennifer. She actually had DACA, grew up in the United States, had never even been to Mexico since she was 3 years old, doesn't know, America is her home. She lived in Texas near the border. She was pregnant, and she was terrified about losing her DACA status under Trump, under the last administration. And she ended up having her baby. She and her husband both lost their DACA status because they did not have something like $700 to renew it. And so now their daughter is a citizen, and they are terrified of being deported. This is another woman who had 3 kids in the United States, has lived in Austin, Texas for 20 years, ended up delivering her 4th baby in her bedroom because she was so scared to go to the hospital in Austin, where she delivered her other children. I forgot her name. I think it was Maria, but she had been Melissa. She had been living in the United States, had all intentions of paying for her delivery, ended up having issues with her pregnancy, delivered prematurely, ended up in the hospital, had to ask for Medicare. She and her husband were terrified, again, of being deported. I then went across the border into Matamoros, and there are these 2 women. This is something that's happening, that's new in the United States. A lot of women come to the US when they're very heavily pregnant. They'd like to deliver in the US so their babies can get immigration status, can get passports. These 2 women went. Both of them, one of them ended up having contractions when she crossed in, was taken by border control to a hospital, was given an injection to stop her contractions, and deported back across the border. The other woman was 8 months. Usually they're treated as vulnerable and they're allowed to stay in the US. I saw a pattern of that not happening anymore, and they're actually deported back to Mexico. And so this is in the camp in Matamoros, people who have tried repeatedly to cross into the US and they get sent back. And this is a woman who came from Honduras, and she did make it into the US, 7 months pregnant with her 2 children. And this is just some of the recent COVID-19 work. I live in London. I'm calling in now from London. I have spent the last year photographing the pandemic here. I wasn't seeing any images really coming out of the hospitals here in the UK, and it was difficult because the numbers were really high, but yet we were seeing no visuals. And I didn't see any journalists, local journalists covering it. And finally, after 3 months of trying to get into a hospital, I was able to get into several different hospitals. And these are some of the images from the United Kingdom, both in the intensive care units. This is a man, Faisal, on the ECMO unit. That is a machine that essentially does the job of the lungs for someone in respiratory failure. And you take the blood out, it takes out the carbon dioxide and puts it back in clean in the body. This is William with his nurse. And because no family was able to visit, often the medical staff becomes family. And this is the most recent wave in January. Here are some of the funeral homes totally overwhelmed. This is a woman who wanted to be buried with her stuffed animal. And this is some of the funeral homes overwhelmed. There were 40 COVID bodies in a garage that was normally meant for a hearse. And a funeral worker saying goodbye to his mother in the own funeral home, and a burial. And then just some images out of McAllen, Texas. I was able to go back to the border region where I spent so much time photographing. And this is a woman, her daughter is praying to her as she passes away. And again, it's so heartbreaking to see these scenes where family is not able to come in. So people are dying alone, they're being treated alone. We've seen it for a year, but I think it's important we don't forget it.
So Lynsey, I'm looking at some of the questions in the Q&A. Thank you for all of your questions, folks, and please, feel free to send in more. One of the questions that several people are asking is, how do you deal with the stress and the distress when you're seeing these people that way? How does it affect you?
I think so long as I'm photographing and literally looking through my camera, and my camera is sort of a shield, I feel like I'm so focused on trying to tell the story that I often don't let my emotions overwhelm me. But there are many times where I do actually cry while I'm seeing something, because it's inevitable that I end up putting, what if this were my mother? What if this were, and I'm constantly making those connections because we're human beings, of course. And so I think I allow myself to get emotional. I think it's important, and it's human nature.
Have you ever gotten training from some of the organizations that you're working for?
It's funny because when I first started covering war, for example, and seeing these really tough scenes, I was a super poor freelancer. I mean, I had no money in the bank, and those training courses for how to deal with not only conflict, but if something happens or your emotional trauma, they cost at that time $5,000.
But what about the organizations that are hiring you? Like, Time Magazine, have they ever thought about, or do they give you training?
I think it's really different now. I mean, essentially, by the time organizations started offering training, I had already been kidnapped twice and been through so much that I think it was kind of like I could probably teach the class. So I think now it's a very different world journalistically than it was when I first started. I think, we have to travel often with security guards who are not armed, but they are there to help us navigate when it's too dangerous to stay and make all these decisions that initially we would make on our own.
Well, what kind of things do you do? Are there like tricks? What kind of things do you do to try and stay safe? So, for instance, in one of the photos, you said, okay, well, I decided not to go to the front lines.
So I think, I'm constantly making calculations, and I'm constantly weighing, is there a sort of safe zone to pull back to, and how far is that safe zone? And why do I need to go that far forward? Like, what is the image that I will make that I can't make elsewhere? And so I'm constantly making calculations. Are there, one thing we have to think about as journalists now is kidnappings, because that is, they're very lucrative to kidnap a foreign journalist. Often there's a ransom paid. Americans have a policy of not paying ransom. So, that I think in effect helps us. But I think, it's really scary now just traveling down a road, because you don't know if your car will be carjacked and you'll be pulled out and then be a victim of kidnap. So I think there are a lot of things I'm constantly weighing. I'm also thinking about the safety of my driver, my translator, so it's a real sort of, and I have to weigh, is it worth it at the end?
Yeah, it's always this tug of war. Like, can I stay one more hour to get this photo on the sunset? But wait a second, then if I'm caught in it's dark, that's really tricky. So you also had a section where you added the audio. So do you at times think about adding a video? How do you make that decision between a photograph versus video?
Yeah, so I often, when I'm shooting, I will toggle between stills. I'll shoot some video. I'll record audio. The problem is, by the time the story comes together, I often don't have the time to deal with the different mediums. And I think increasingly a lot of publications don't have, not only the bandwidth, but the money, the budget to actually pay an editor to put together everything. And so that video I showed, I paid for that on my own. The New York Times Magazine did not do a multimedia piece, and I felt so strongly about the fact that the audio was a really important part of that story. So I ended up just paying an editor to help me put that together.
Wow. Okay. So I see you want to show us some more, another section.
Go ahead. More just from the last, this is Philadelphia for the New York Times Magazine. I ended up going to cover elections there. It was shocking for me to work back in America, so divided. The hatred was really palpable on both sides. It was something I haven't really covered news in America in a long time. So it was pretty shocking. So these are some of those images. That's at a Trump rally after Biden was declared winner. This is in Harrisburg at the Capitol, Pennsylvania. Some of these scenes. And so, Yeah, I mean, it's just been really interesting for me to sort of go back and forth between working abroad and then working back at home. And
And
then
when you,
yeah.
okay, no, I was going to say that when you're abroad, do you find, and you did mention that being a woman in some places in Afghanistan really helped you because you were able to get access to it. But do you think that it's being more accepted now that as a woman photojournalist that maybe, it is easier, or is there still a huge kind of discrimination against women as photojournalists abroad?
I don't think abroad, right? Not in the
Yeah.
US. 'Cause in the US, there are tons of women.
Right.
I think-
Well, like conservative cultures, like in the, Muslim communities, or in, certainly places like Afghanistan or Iraq.
Well, I think it always helps to be a woman in conservative places because I have access to women and men. So it's not, I think I'm not limited by my gender, whereas, I'm not treated as an equal in terms of, there are people sort of tend to dismiss me, like they don't take me as seriously, but I actually like that. I think that's something I can really use to my advantage as a journalist, because you can kind of slip under the radar. So in conservative places, it's really an asset to be a woman.
Oh, interesting. Well, here, please take us through this. Wow, this is a horrific photo.
So these are the wildfires. These are during the height of the wildfire season in California. I was actually working on a different story in the UK. I was covering COVID and breast cancer. But I got a climate change grant for National Geographic. It's a piece on climate change in women. Eventually, I'll end up covering 5 different countries around the world. And so this is just the start of the California section. And so I've never covered wildfires. I've never covered climate change stories. So this is all very, very new to me. What you're seeing in the Coachella Valley are real extremes in temperatures that's damaging lettuce and bell peppers. And also I wanted to look at how climate change was affecting migrant workers themselves and their families. So this is all that. So that's
going to be really interesting. That's going to be really, really interesting. So I think we're actually basically on, up against time. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to some of your questions. They were all wonderful, terrific questions. Please take a look at the exhibit at Skirball. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Jen for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. And thank you, Lynsey and Sheryl, so much. Wow, that was really powerful. Let me start my video here. Thank you both so much. Extremely powerful. And Lynsey, we want you to take good care. Seeing all those images, I have to say that really just brings up for me that I want you to take good care. But don't stop bringing us all of what you're doing, and Sheryl, you too, because what I said in the beginning about empathy, I think now that we've all sat through those images and been close to tears a few times, it really is what your work is about. So please do visit skirball.org and check out Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope on our website. And we would like to thank our donors who made that possible. These are very tricky times for nonprofit arts. And so we are very grateful to Rebecca and Howard Farber, the Ford Foundation, the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, the Karsh Family Foundation, and US Bank. So thank you all for making that possible for us to continue our work. So we would like you all to take good care. We look forward to welcoming you to the Skirball when it is safe and possible to do so, which we hope will be very soon. Take good care no matter where you are in the world, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, thanks. Thanks, Sheryl. Bye.
Thank you, Lynsey, terrific.
Thank you.